Certainly an interesting situation when you have to introduce your son. He wouldn't give me his bio, so I have to make it up. Anyways, my boys went to Grand River Collegiate way back when Greg started writing the wrestling report, and he wrote that all through high school. He had some cooperation from his brother and from some other players, but he wrote about wrestling. And he joined the Cauliflower Alley Club, and he's pursued that, and he continues to pursue that. However, ECW Press, his publisher, told him that he would sell 4 times as many hockey books as wrestling. And so he started to write about hockey. And he's got quite a few of the books up here. He's written at least a dozen books now. There's a nice brochure here that itemizes some of the books that he's written. But his first half a dozen books were wrestling, and then he wrote hockey. It's interesting that he's met so many people, and his son has gone for the ride, of course. He belongs to the Hockey Association of the Maple Leafs in Toronto. Greg's from Toronto now. And so he's just met all kinds of people, and it's wonderful that he can carry on like that. Anyways, without a lot of belaboring it, we'll introduce him right now. Come on, Greg.
No, Dad, you didn't screw up too much. Thank you. You do have to wonder about a father who calls his son and asks, "Can I get a biography, please?" It's like, geez, were you paying attention all those years? And of course the answer is no, because he was off working. But Zares Markets, where he worked for so many years, offered lots of opportunities, including the chance to reprint those newsletters for me. It's a great example. Let me just get this going here. Couldn't get the... So here's a great example of the opportunities we've gotten. I pulled my son out of school early, and we went down where we met my dad for a Canada Post stamp event, and we got to meet Bobby Orr. But what I remember about this wasn't just meeting Bobby Orr. Fergie Jenkins was there, and for those of you who know, he's a Canadian from Chatham who's in the Baseball Hall of Fame. So I was excited to meet him because he'd actually signed a contract with the St. Louis Blues for $1, which I discovered when I was working on these books with Alan Stitt. And so I hadn't been able to get in touch with Fergie. We've been exchanging messages with his people. And when you run a foundation like he does, he's got people. So I hadn't done it, so I got to ask him in person about it. And so that made it its way into one of the books. But what I really remember is my dad, and he's there and he's chatting with Fergie Jenkins about farming. So to his credit, he's able to talk to just about anybody. The other great story about my son ends up in the book about Father Bauer, which is what I'll get to here in a second. But my dad took Quinn out to the Waterloo Region Sports Hall of Fame. And my son, who was about 7 at the time, came back with little handwritten scribbled notes about Father Bauer that he'd seen there at the event. So thanks, Dad, for being a great dad, getting us out to lots of opportunities. It's great here seeing some of these things in Kitchener because I grew up in Kitchener. Certainly some people know my brother, Chris Oliver, who's the head coach at Winter University. So he's got lots of ties to the city. I played minor soccer here. I played minor basketball. I was not very good. And unfortunately, I think my son's inherited some of those genes. But we love the sport. We love sports in general. I did 1 year at the KW Record as well in the sports department, working the overnight shift after high school. So I was working like 7 to 2 in the morning while going to high school on a part-time basis. And it was enough to give me the desire to do more, but I also realized I couldn't do high school and work those ridiculous hours. This all leads to a lot of mentions of fathers, and I'd like to bring up a little bit about Father Bauer. For those, there we go. For those of you who don't know, Father Bauer was from Kitchener-Waterloo. He basically grew up right in the middle of town, right near the border of the two cities. On the left is, we say Aloysius is how you'd say that, I believe. So that's his grandfather. He came here and he set up what would become Bauer Industries, which it still exists. It ended up making, he had the foresight in the 1917 that cars are going to matter. And so he started getting involved with the manufacturing of the felt covers for car seats. That's still a big part of the Bauer Industries. It's changed over the years. Obviously, car making has changed too. But to have the foresight there is pretty unbelievable. His own son is Edgar. And to me, it's a great example of what you're all doing here as well. It's about community. And it was a really big deal to Edgar to be involved in the community. Certainly the church, the Catholic Church was a big part of it. He played hockey as a youth. I actually found a record of when he signed his OHA card, which is what you had to do back in the day. He was actually president of the Waterloo Baseball Association at one point. He was an alderman. He served on the Waterloo Public Utilities Commission. And then his son Frank, who was the brother of Father Bauer, was actually an alderman in Waterloo, and he was the mayor for a year, 54 to 55. But there's a lot of lessons you take away from your parents, and it's a step towards a greater life. And what David Bauer decided to do is to follow the path of a couple of his older brothers, and he went to St. Michael's College. As a researcher, it's amazing sometimes what you can find. So you go down to St. Michael's College, and they have a little library tucked away, and they're able to dig up some amazing old pictures. Like this. And as a guy who worked at the Toronto Sun Library for 3 years, I really loved research. And so finding things like this is pretty cool. He was born in 1924. There were 11 Bauer children. And David Bauer was the youngest boy, and there was 3 sisters that were younger than him. So 6 boys and 5 girls. There was also one that was that died at birth. But what everybody remembers isn't Father Bauer at that time, because growing up in Kitchener, David Bauer didn't mean anything yet. We jumped ahead here a little bit. So he's at St. Michael's College on the left, and on the right, that's the Memorial Cup winning team. But as you can see, it's not the same team. What happened during the war was the teams were allowed to make 3 call-ups. And so they called up David Bauer, Ted Lindsay, and Gus Morton. All 3 guys were superb players. And they ended up on the Oshawa Generals, and they won the Memorial Cup that year. But what really was driven home to David Bauer was the value of education. So again, amazing finds. Here's him at school, and on the left is him playing for the University of Toronto. So after he went to St. Michael's College, he decided to pursue an education further, and he wanted a teaching degree. But he still played hockey while he was there, until he changed his mind. And then he decided to enter the priesthood. And this ended up changing a lot of people's lives. And he was a very influential person in so many ways, not just in hockey. I did briefly skip over, he also did serve in the Canadian Army right at the end of the war. He had to finish school, and that was 1945 when he served, and the war was just ending. So he never served overseas. Sorry about that. I think my laptop's older than Emily, so. Here they are. So he ends up going back to St. Michael's College, where he's a teacher. And he gets involved with the hockey program. And he works with every level of hockey. And it was a tight-knit school where you got to know the boys that were there, and it was just boys at the time. And he basically stuck with the kids through the different levels, and some of his players, like a Barry McKenzie, a Terry Miley, stuck with him all the way through. They made it to what we would now call like the equivalent of the Kitchen Rangers, right? The junior hockey team, junior A. And so here they are receiving their Stetsons and their rings from Mayor Nathan Phillips in Toronto. Just in front of Father Bauer, who's in the middle, to his right is Jim Gregory, who's VP of the NHL now. He owes basically his entire career to Father Bauer. And I was fortunate enough that Jim Gregory wrote the foreword to the book on Father Bauer. Basically, one day Father Bauer said, well, what are you doing today? Come on down. And he took him down to meet Stafford Smythe down at Maple Leaf Gardens, and basically Stafford hired him to take care of the Leafs minor hockey situation. And he went on from there, became general manager of the Leafs, and about a couple of days after Harold Ballard decided to fire Jim Gregory, he was hired by the NHL, and he's still there today. I can't remember exactly how old he is, but he's like 86, that's probably about right, and he's still working at the NHL. Here's a great picture, just happiness with the Memorial Cup. In my book, a bunch of the guys tell stories about coming back to Kitchener for a big party that the family had, just to celebrate. What happens though is sometimes people get a little too big for their britches, maybe one way to look at it. Father Bauer went from winning the Memorial Cup with the St. Michael's Majors to the Majors dropping out of junior hockey because they thought it was taking away from the players and their ability to do schoolwork. It's because they wanted education to become what was paramount. So instead, the Basilian Fathers, which ran the school and took care of Father Bauer here, said, you know what, we're going to reassign you. So instead of a hockey hotbed, like Toronto, they sent him out to University of British Columbia, where the team had been sat-sack. The Thunderbirds weren't very good at all. And initially he wasn't even the coach, but the players persuaded him to be involved. It's like we have one of the best coaches in the country here at the school, you know, teaching at St. Mark's College. Let's get him involved. So eventually his love of hockey won him over, and here he is helping out with the Thunderbirds. Which all leads to a magical thing. Between his brothers, which I'm coming to in a second, Canada was always really important, okay, to Father Bauer and to the family. And well, I think the next picture is the one I'm looking for. All right, so now we're jumping back in time a little bit. The most famous Bauer is, anybody know his name? Bobby Bauer. Okay, so in the picture here we have the famous Kraut line. So Milt Donald, who just passed recently, oh sorry, Milt Schmidt. Milt Donald's a journalist, yeah, sorry, Milt Schmidt, and Bobby Bauer in the middle, and Woody Dumark. And everybody knew who they were in town. And so growing up, you're big brothers in the NHL. So, you know, obviously you benefit from that. David Bauer got to go to some Boston Bruins training camps. And eventually, as a 16-year-old, he actually got to try out and was basically invited to be a part of the the Boston Bruins organization if he wanted to do that. And that's where his turning point in his life was. Do I go into hockey? Do I go into something else? So instead, he decided to stay involved with schooling, and that's the St. Mike's experience. Here's another great picture. Okay, this is all coming together here in a second. So a great picture, that's Art Ross in the back. With Bobby Bauer on the right. You can see he's not quite as tall as the other guys. But what happened here is Bobby Bauer comes back to Kitchener. He gets involved with hockey. And so the Kitchener-Waterloo Dutchmen were a huge part of this community. They were the Flying Dutchmen at one point, and they dropped it by this point. So 1956 and 1960, the Dutchmen are chosen to represent Canada on the national, like in the Olympics. This is the way it was back then. The best senior team in the country, usually the Allen Cup winner, were invited to go represent Canada abroad. Up until 52, that was great, because we always won, right? Or if we didn't win, it was another team, like the 36 British team. They were basically all Canadians anyway. So we'd done really well up till then. But 52 was the last time we headed to Mercury's, won a gold. 56, the Dutchman didn't win. 1960, the Dutchman didn't win. All of a sudden, the hockey world had started to pass Canada. We had the Czechs that were great. We, of course, had the Russians that were just on their way to going into superstardom. And we had the Swedes that were pretty good. We could still handle the Finns on a regular basis. So this is all tying into Canada. And this is a good example of what we ended up with, is that we go nationally or internationally and start get pummeled. It wasn't our game anymore. So Father Bauer had gone down in 1962 to the World Championships, were in Colorado Springs, and he sat there with his brother Ray, and there were other power brokers that were there from the various levels, Canadian amateur hockey, and they talked a little bit about options. What could we do for 1964 when the Olympics were going to be in Innsbruck? So they talked, and eventually Father Bauer came up with the idea, let's make a national team that's based in one spot where we all train together and we have a real team, a real unity to it. And the problem was, of course, the best players were playing in the NHL, and you couldn't be professional to represent your country. In either, actually the Olympic Committee and the World Championships, they had slightly different rules of what an amateur was. But essentially you had to not be playing professional hockey, or you've gotten your amateur status back. So Father Bauer came up with the idea of a national team, and he set it up in British Columbia at the university there. They were given an old building that they basically said, here you go, you guys can all live here. They had to spend, weeks while going to school building an actual facility where they could sleep. One guy, George Swarbrick, actually didn't go to school. He was the only one on the team at the time that wasn't enrolled in university, but he happened to be a carpenter. An electrician. So he was able to do a lot of the work on the actual house, the hockey house where they stayed. And a couple of the rowers actually moved in too, to make it just a little bit wilder place to live. Are you in this picture, Rod? Okay, so this is just a pre-Olympic picture that they made up as a postcard. And Canadians abroad are well loved, and that's still true today. Wherever the Canadian team went, they had little pins, they had these postcards to hand out that they gave out everywhere. And this is one of them. So they put together this team to go to Innsbruck, and one of the last minute call-ins is here today, and we'll have him up here at the end, is Rod Seiling, who was playing with the Marlies, very successful junior, one of the top juniors in the country, and they parachuted him in essentially for the last couple of weeks of the for the Olympic tournament. Here we are at the end of the tournament. You can see the great Hudson Bay coats. They got the, are you in this picture? Somewhere. The story is pretty convoluted. We don't really, you can ask Rod a little bit more about it, but essentially Canada was robbed of a medal. They changed the rules at the last minute behind the scenes. So, pardon? During the game. Well, that's pretty last minute. So, depending on how you interpret the rules were either there before or they weren't, and there were different rules for the World Championship than there were for the Olympics on how you determine a winner. Bunny Heron was the guy who ran the international hockey, and he basically screwed Canada. There's really no other word for it. And that's a big part of the story. And it makes it fascinating because we take hockey so for granted. We've won the last couple of gold medals, but there was a time when that was not a given. One of the highlights for the team, though, it's often the little things, right? The people you meet, like some of the guys tell me about meeting Ingmar Johansson, the famous boxer, while they were in Innsbruck. There's the events that happen at the Olympics. After the Olympics, the team got an audience with the Pope in Rome. And there's a hilarious story just about how that happened, because they weren't supposed to. They were just supposed to be the proper little things got pulled and little sneaky things happened. They happened to meet a priest who was from Chicago, who pulled the right strings, and they got an audience. Were you there for that one? You gone home by then? So the one guy, Ross Morrison, tells a lot of stories, but he talked about how his ex-mother-in-law loved him forever because he gave her a rosary that had been blessed by the Pope when they went. So Canada kept playing, and Father Bauer kept involved without success. That's the amazing thing. It's like 65, we didn't win in the World Championship. 66, we didn't win in the World Championship. 67, we didn't win. Are you sensing a theme here? It was frustrating. There might be a bronze medal, but we could never really get over the Russians or the Czechs consistently. There might be an occasional win here or there, but the way the tournaments were set up, it just was not possible. Father Bauer still had a day job out at St. Mark's College. So he was teaching out there, and of course he was still a priest. So he'd run Mass. So we brought in different people to help coach. On the left, in the middle, is Gord Simpson, who was in charge of the Winnipeg Maroons, which were an amateur team. They won the Allen Cup in 64, 65. And so what they decided to do was, for a year, they would merge the national team with the Winnipeg Maroons. So you had all these guys who had day jobs, who were old, and were, it's not quite beer league hockey because these guys were athletes, but often they played in the NHL, they'd settled in the city, and they took a day job. But they were still playing hockey competitively. And then you had these guys who were in university. Most of them had transferred from BC to the University of Winnipeg and still continued to represent their country. And then on the right is Shaky McLeod, Jack McLeod, who had played in the NHL, and he was tapped to be the coach. And he was basically the coach of the team from 66 right through to 1970 when the team was disbanded. And I was lucky enough to get to talk to all these gentlemen for the book. So Gord Simpson was wonderful. Jackie, he knew everything, right? He was a walking encyclopedia of what happened, and not scared of sharing his opinions. We did have a small bit of success. In 1967, Canada hosted a centennial tournament in Winnipeg, and we did win that one. There was only 3 teams, but we managed to win the gold in that, and you can see that's Pearson over there on the left, shaking hands and then on the right is Captain Roger Bourbonnais with the cup. This was all a setting up supposedly to have the World Championships for the first time ever in Canada in 1970. Another great action shot. So here's the team in 67-68. So we went to Grenoble for the Olympics there, and we fared better this time. We won a bronze medal. The team was better prepared. They certainly knew the international play the same way. A little bit like Rod Ring brought into the team. They brought in a few other studs right at the end, like Brian Glennie, who was basically, he ended up playing for the Leafs and in the NHL for years, but he was a kid that had the chance to play for the Olympics, and his dad had always dreamed about that, and his dad had recently passed, so he took the opportunity and went to the Olympics, and didn't play right away in the NHL. Anybody recognize the guy on the left, besides Rod? It's Ken Dryden, right. Even Dryden had a few kicks of the can playing, so he finished at Cornell, and he flew over for the World Championship in '67, playing for Canada. One of the last quotes I added to the book, Dryden hadn't responded to my interview request. So there was a Summit Series event in Toronto that they forgot to invite you. You were there?
Organized.
Were you there? Don't have your autograph, I didn't know. Jeez, sorry about that. Anyway, Dryden was at this event, and my son, who was 9 at the time, he got up and asked Dryden a question in front of everybody that I needed for the book. So, because I knew he wouldn't say no. And so he asked them, can you tell us how the Russians in '69 were different than the Russians in '72 in the Summit Series? So Dryden, being a man of many words, he essentially said that they were basically different teams, right? Because by '72 we had a lot of the younger Russians that started representing it, whereas '69 it was sort of the end of their great run. And then at the right I put a picture here. This is Rick Newman, who's a really important figure in this Father Bauer thing. Not only did he know him at St. Mike's, he stuck with him the whole way, sort of as a trainer, jack of all trades, but he gets involved a little bit later. That's my next slide. Yeah, so here's the team in '69. They started to change the rules after the '68 Olympics, that some pros were allowed to play hockey, play amateur hockey. So there were weird kind of rules, but we had some guys that had played the NHL that were not in the NHL any longer, but were allowed to play on the national team. All of a sudden Canada started doing a little bit better. We go to the Investia tournament in Russia and basically almost win it. We start taking the Russians to task, all of a sudden, because our better players are involved. And they ended up changing the rules so that we couldn't go anymore. And Canada balked at the whole idea, and in 1970, when we were supposed to host the World Championships, Canada walked away from the table and said, we're not going to play international hockey anymore until you even the playing field. And it's a lot of things we forget. So the Summit Series, which Rod played in, was such a huge deal, but Canada was not playing international hockey at the time. So we weren't in the World Championships. We weren't in the '72 Olympics. We weren't in the '76 Olympics. So it took Alan Eagleson, which is a nasty name to a lot of people, but he brought international hockey back and brought Canada back into the fold. And so the '77 World Championships we were involved with a promise that we'd go into the Olympics. So that comes up with the 1980 team. Most people know the 1980 Olympics because of the Miracle on Ice. Well, Canada had manhandled the American team all through the lead up to it. I think we played them 8 times and won 7 of the games. But they were in a different pool than Canada in the Olympics. So we did end up playing them, and a couple of bad breaks. The one goalie let in a goal that was basically 200 feet down the ice, and it went through his legs. And that's one of the reasons Canada lost. So Father Bauer was involved in that team. That's the really neat thing. And this all brings it back to how I got involved with this project. So I was at a luncheon, or I guess it wasn't a luncheon, but it was an event like this with people who love sports, and Tom Watt was there. Tom Watt was one of the 3 coaches that they had for this Olympic team in 1980. And Tom Watt said Father Bauer was such a fascinating figure. He was the manager of this team in many ways, but Rick Newman was the guy that did all the work, who I showed you a picture of. And so Tom Watts said, you could be talking to Father Bauer about religion, and the hockey guy would come out. Or you could be talking about hockey, and the religious side would come out. He was a fascinating man that way, that was full of life for sure, and full of wisdom, but he also liked to let you talk, and what a great listener he was. On the right is a great example of the 3 generations. So on the left is Terry O'Malley, and he's wearing the original 1964 jerseys. In the middle is Father Bauer, and on the right is Trent Yawny, who went on to play in the NHL. And this is the 1988 team that was in Calgary. In 1988, they also dedicated an arena to Father Bauer in Calgary, so which was unique because it was one of the few international-sized rinks that are in Canada. He kept involved. He stayed out there at St. Mark's as a priest and as a minister as a teacher for so many years. But he also kept his ties to St. Mike's. So Rangers fans will remember St. Michael's College came back into junior hockey for a number of years, and so here he is wearing one of those jerseys when they came back for a dinner, and him on the right. I think that's Henry Carr in the picture, who's one of his mentors. And I'd like to end off a little bit about loyalty. And Rod will certainly speak to it, I'm sure. He commanded a great loyalty. And I think that's part of the reason we have Father Father David Bauer Drive here in town. He meant so much to so many people. He was one of the first recipients of the Order of Canada in '67 because he made such an impact on people's lives, not just through hockey. Hockey, education, religion. This was an amazing picture that Ken Broderick had, though all these guys have a copy of it. So this is Father Bauer near the end of his life. And all these boys who had played with him, they went down to visit him. So, you know, Paul Commons in that picture, Ken Broderick, Marshall Johnson, Roger Bourbonnais, I think. So they all went down to visit him in Goderich, like weeks before he died, and made a big event out of it. Mike Smith's in that picture too. Oh, okay, well then that's my last one. So when I was working on this book, that's what probably took away the most, is that he commanded a loyalty that you don't hear about anymore, and that's really unfortunate. And even today, I had lunch with a friend that I went to Grand River Collegiate with, and one of my best friends, and we were talking a little bit about teachers, and like there were teachers that meant a lot to me over the years, but never that I kept in touch with. And I sort of regret that, because I was never able to tell Mrs. Griffiths at Stanley Park that she was the one that really encouraged me to write. Thank you. Here I am 13 books later, Dad. You really do need a biography. It was a wonderful experience. So, yeah, I would like to say, so yeah, I wrote about a priest, and my latest book, The 13th, which Dad has not read, he only just got today, is called Gratuity the Loony, and it's my first autobiography where I worked with a guy, and Gilles Breton was the kind of guy who was crazy nuts. He would tell the coach that he couldn't play tonight because the stars weren't aligned. He's a real character, so I've written about heaven, I've written about hell, all in 1 year. So, with that in mind, I thought we could maybe just pull up a couple of chairs, and if you have questions for me and for Rod, we'll happy to answer. You want to come up? You can tell a couple of stories. You were there. I just collect stories. Rod Seiling.
Thank you, Greg. Playing for Pear was a great experience. I think there are a lot of things I can thank him for, and some other things that I wouldn't thank him for. But perhaps the most important, in a strange sense of a way, is when I was a young minor hockey player in Elmira, I was most fortunate, was most sought after, one of the most sought after minor players. So I had my choice of which of the 6 NHL teams I would go to. And I chose St. Michael's because it was an opportunity to combine education and hockey. And so my very first practice with the majors, and Father Bauer was on the ice, the first thing he taught all of us, and of course with older players there as well, so they had to go through it again, was how to protect ourselves. And I think the most enduring thing that I can say about the long career ahead in NHL, and touch wood, and I'm in a volunteer brain injury study, and to this point they still say I have a brain and it's not that injured. So, and I have to give a lot of credit to Father Bauer, because I used the skills that he taught me as a 15-year-old, just turning 16 in Toronto, through that whole career, and it served me well. And when I think back of the players that I played with, who are much less fortunate and have had severe problems, many untold, but it's a byproduct of the game that is not the nicest, but it's a fact of life, and we have to deal with it. But I have to thank Father Bauer for that, and he didn't have to drill education in me, because when I was growing up, I had one rule at home with my parents: if you did well in school and passed, you could play hockey. If you didn't, you didn't. I never tested it, but and the same thing as at Mike's. I did well at school. Was able to play the game that I loved and make a career of it, and was able to represent my country twice international, which is a great honor. I have to tell you, there isn't a better feeling in my lifetime, and I think that I can say the same for the players I played with. Those who won Stanley Cups, many rings. 72 experience is a highlight of all our careers. But standing on the blue line with the maple leaf on your chest and playing the national anthem does something for you. And if it doesn't, you better check yourself in because you may not be alive.
Do we have any questions?
I've got one.
Yeah.
Surprise, surprise. When you were in Moscow, two of you were there. John was there. You were there. I was at the game in Toronto, the game number 2. And then Phil makes his comments when you're out west. And you go and you come back and you win that. And then you come home and you had that reception at Toronto City Hall, which my wife and I drove down to. And I've never been, ever, in a place that had that kind of euphoria. When you guys drove in, you were 2 or 3 hours late, we'd all been singing. Tell me as a player and a person, what you guys felt like when you came to the City Hall on your return.
Well, before we get to that part of your question, and I do know that a number of you were in Moscow, I have to tell you, the 3,000 of you made a huge difference. For those of you who can't remember, like, well, they say the mind's the first thing to go. We should have won all 4 games in Moscow. We didn't. We had the lead, notwithstanding the refereeing and all that, but we should have. And the important part that the 3,000 Canadians played often goes underreported and underappreciated. Because when we left Canada after the game in Vancouver, I don't think as a team or as an individual, we had many friends in this country, including maybe some of our own families, because we had let them down. Canadians had been brainwashed to believe that we would wipe the Soviets clean. It'd be a romp, 8-0, and it would be nothing. I remember going to Harry Sinden before after the lineup was being announced. We knew the day before who was playing that game, and we dressed 5 defensemen. And I went to Harry and John Ferguson, asked for a meeting with them in the room, and I begged them to dress 6 defensemen. I said, we need 6 defensemen, we can't compete. Well, you know that would come to the first game, and you know that we dress 6 defensemen the rest of the series. But I have to going back to the 3,000 crazy Canucks that went over. I think one of the most enduring things was, I was talking about it before dinner, one of the 3,000 was the gentleman who played the trumpet in the Charge of Light Brigade at the Montreal Forum. And when I was playing for the Rangers, it used to drive me absolutely crazy because I just hated it. Because it just got the fans going, and we didn't need anything else to get the Canadians going back in those days. But anyway, he was escorted out of the building during the game, that first game in Moscow, and was thrown out of the country. What the Soviets didn't know was that he recorded the charge. And the Canadian fans played it ad nauseum during the remaining 3 games. And the Soviet soldiers they'd hear the part of the rink, they'd run up to try and find it. By that time, the Canadians had passed it to the other side of the rink and would play again. So the remaining 3 games, it was the best show going. You'd watch the Soviet soldiers run up different parts of the stadium to try and find it. They never did, of course, because they got passed around I'm not sure how many recordings there were, obviously more than one, but it was comic relief to say the least. Anyway, back to the rest of your... It was amazing to see the number of Canadians who had stood out in the rain. If you remember, it was a pouring rain. And we were late. We were... The major reason why we were late, because we landed in Montreal and dropped off all the French-Canadian players. And of course, our Prime Minister had to be part of the celebration, and so he had to get up. So they put us in fire trucks and we drove around the airport in Montreal. Serge Savard, Prime Minister Trudeau was actually climbing up and missed. Savard and I grabbed him by the collar and yanked him up where he might have been Prime Minister now, because he was on his way right back. He'd fallen right in his head off the fire truck. But depending on the political persuasion, you might be happy we did it, you may not be. I'll leave that to you. But it was truly amazing to see the people had stood out there in the pouring rain. They had a little makeshift tent for us to stand under. But to watch the people out there who stood there, and we knew you'd been out there for 2 or 3 hours, it gave, between Montreal and Toronto, it gave us a sneak peek of what the series really meant to Canadians. Because you remember back in those days, you had a telegraph and a telegram, that was your, or a phone call, that was the only way of communication. So on the board outside our dressing room, they had a great big board, and each day there'd be more and more telegrams posted on there. But we had no real inkling of what the team meant, what the series meant to Canada and to Canadians until it started to sink in then. Obviously, as the years have gone on, we realized the turning point as to what it meant. And in fact, you talk to Canadians, even to this day, they know the games, they know, and for most of you of our age, there are 3 places they can tell you in their life. When Kennedy got shot, number 1, and where they were watching that game. Now, I tell a lot of people now they're a lot younger. You're just telling me that now because you want me to know that you're much younger than I am. But anyway, it was something, and it meant a lot to us because we went through a lot. We went to war, and I can truly say that I'm fortunate I never had to go to real war. But from talking to soldiers and the experience they had and the experience we had, there are a lot of similarities. And we did it for one reason, and one reason only, for our country, because we sure as hell didn't get paid. Frank, I'd be remiss if I didn't get back to Father Bauer, and he made reference to it. We did get screwed out of the medal. We were playing the Soviets for the gold medal game, and under the rules that were in effect when the game started, the worst we could do was get a bronze. But Bunny Ahern, who ran the International Ice Hockey Federation at the time, did not like Canada. That would be a gross understatement. Called together the powers that be and changed the rules so that if we lost the game, we finished 4th. During the game, in fact, I'll close with my Father Bauer story. So we didn't know this until after the game. We're sitting in the dressing room, and someone comes in and said, by the way, don't bother going back up for the medal ceremony. They changed the rules while you were playing. You finished 4th. So a number of us were not very happy, and we found a bar that wasn't very far from Olympic Village. After the game, we went and had a few pops. And we didn't have a lot. We really behaved ourselves, but we wanted to blow off some steam, so to speak. And when we get back to our room, he had done a room check. On each of our bed was, please come and see me now, not in the morning. So we had to trudge on down to his room where he chastised us for not being good Christians and good sportsmen. Father Bauer.
And there's 1,000 stories like that. Like he had a very personable, he was very personable, but he also had his ideas what things should be. There's, they would have curfew sometimes. He got better as the guys got older. I think got a little bit more lenient. But that 64 team, he was on his own. He really had him and just Bob Imarch, who was the guy at the University of British Columbia that really helped him a ton. But back to the Summit Series, there is a section in the book where all the Canadian players, they all told me a similar story. All the guys who played for Father Bauer, they all had stories of, I told you so, for this Summit Series, because all the national hockey team, all the guys that went from the NHL, there was Rod, Ken Dryden, and Harry Sinden, who'd played for the Young Dogs. They were about the only guys who played international hockey that had any sort of inkling. Am I forgetting somebody? I think that's it. So there was only really 3 of them that had any idea what they were getting into. So, and you could see how much they listened initially. Is there any other questions? Cool. Well, thanks for coming out. Got some books here, and it's cool to be back home.
I'm sure Greg and Rod will be hanging around for a few minutes after, and I don't know about the rest of you, but I could probably just sit here and listen for the rest of the night, because we all like to hear stories. And I think we all, particularly those of us who are a little older, we like to hear stories about times when we were actually around, and we hear the version from a person like Rod, and we hear versions from a person like Greg, who's done all of the research that he's done about things that we witnessed and we read about. So it's just, Greg, it was fantastic.
Thank you.
Really, really good.